morning, everybody, and welcome. Great to see you all here on the third day of this great event. You know, the old adage is if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go farther, go together. So we're here to talk about together, we go farther. I got a great panel here. You know, we're here to talk about collaboration, unlocking shared success on the lunar surface, and talk about a whole of nations approach to technology development and what we can produce together with partners. You know, international is a huge part of my past and what I do today, both at AIAA as the Chief Executive Officer, as well as I'm President of the International Astronautical Federation, a paraspace organization that puts on the International Astronautical Congress every year. So, you know, we talk a lot about space cooperation, we talk about multinational approach and partnerships, and we're going to dive into that topic today. I've got a great panelist. To my immediate left is Dennis Woodfork, who's the National Security Space Missionary Executive here at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. To his left is Niki Werkheiser, who's the Director for Technology Maturation at NASA headquarters. Then we have Blair Bigelow, a space advocate and co-founder of Desert Legacy Capital. Michael Overby, who's Deputy Director for the State Department's Office of Space Affairs, and Marchel Holle, who leads government relations for ispace Incorporated. So it's been said that every nation has a border with space. And I'll add that everyone on Earth can see the moon, at least the near side of the moon, right? When we look up, that's facing us. And I was at a conference in India just a week and a half ago where we had an address by Prime Minister Mowry. And he said that the moon is not just a destination, it's an inspiration to humankind that sparked our collective curiosity from the moment we first looked upon it. I thought it was a beautiful and kind of poetic way to think about the moon. And you know, in Asian and actually in Amerindian folklore, we talk about the moon and we talk about a rabbit on the moon. Sometimes it's called the jade rabbit, sometimes it's goes by other names, but really that rabbit is up there and he's working. He's actually either making rice cakes or he's using a mortar and pestle to actually create some food. So it's really kind of about an industrious rabbit on the lunar surface that's getting stuff done. And I think of it as an analogy to kind of what we think about in the future about living and working on the moon, right? Trying to use the lunar resources and use the lunar surface to make life better here on Earth. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And now, just about every country in the world is thinking about going back to the moon. Not just the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords, but other nations like China and India and others. And India was talking a lot about going back to the moon, and they've, of course, done a successful lunar lander mission. Chinese have done Chang'e 3. We've got a lot of programs that are going back to that lunar surface. So everybody's focused on getting there. Now let's talk about the challenges of how we do it together and what we can do. So to kick that off, Blair, I'm going to ask you to start. Why go back to the moon? Or the better question is, what happens if we don't go back to the moon together?
I love that, Clay, and I think that's a really important reframe. A lot of people ask why go back to the moon, but I think it puts it really in perspective when we say, what happens if we don't? And to put it really simply, the moon is a front line for geopolitical influence. We are risking surrendering the next great economic frontier, a domain that is rich with critical materials, energy potential, and infrastructure advantages that could reshape and define 21st century supply chains. Other countries are not waiting. They are partnering and coordinating and building long-term infrastructure plans. One coalition aims to have a nuclear power plant operational on the moon by 2035, and they've already partnered with over a dozen countries to do so, including major spacefaring nations, but notably not the US. We can't assume that other countries are going to wait for the United States to lead. Other nations have already proven that they're partnering and they're choosing who to partner with based on opportunity, consistency, and inclusion. International collaboration will remain a strength as long as the United States can be seen as a steady partner. If we fail to establish long-term meaningful presence on the moon, we will cede ground in not just space, but in global political and economic leadership. A passive posture is a strategic loss, and I really think that this country has some work to do.
Nice. Michael, from a State Department perspective, right? You guys are right on the front lines of this international collaboration. What's the leading foreign policy challenges to going together back to the surface of the moon? How do you guys see it at State Department?
Well, thanks very much, Clay, and it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I actually think Blair laid it out better than a diplomat could, and I will preface my answer by saying I am a foreign policy nerd. I'm not a space person. I mean, I am now, right? I'm part of the family, but our job really is to respond to that exact moment and to help make sure that we are connecting the dots internally within the US government and externally with our commercial and international partners around both the pipeline of technology development, the commercial activity, the excitement, the innovation that's happening right now, and the geopolitical challenges that Blair just laid out. I mean, our objective, our main purpose is helping NASA move faster, helping our commercial partners move faster, integrating all of our assets, civil, commercial assets, with foreign partners so that we are doing that together in a unified way. And importantly, Clay, to Blair's earlier point, I think it's really important as we move forward and as multiple countries are moving forward to establish a lunar presence of some kind, either robotic, human, short-term, long-term, that we are avoiding as much as possible miscommunication and accidental interference or intentional interference, right? And you know, we can essentially lay the groundwork for how we will function on the moon together, and it will either be by accident or be on purpose, right? And so part of our goal through the Accords, through other mechanisms, is to help lay out some basic principles for how that should work. And so part of our goal is to do that in a way that is drawing on the expertise of industry, but also bringing along new and emerging spacefaring countries. You know, there's over 80 countries, I think, with a satellite in orbit right now. I think over 80 countries, at least 70 countries now have like a space program. So like the game is changing, and I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that they are turning to the United States as a model for how we govern the emerging commercial sector. How do we spark innovation, but do it in a way that's safe and responsible?
Yeah, you know, space, just 10, 20 years ago, space was just kind of the purview, or access to space was the purview of superpowers.
Right.
And now, last year when we were in Milan, Italy, we had over 60 space agencies and offices around a table together. Yeah. And it was really amazing to watch the growth right now. Just about every country now wants to be in. We have, what, 55 signatories to the Artemis Accords?
55 in the Artemis Accords, 104 in the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, right? Yeah. And so that aspiration is very real. And to Blair's point, countries are hungry to develop their own national space law, develop their own regulatory frameworks, open their markets to US businesses, and they will take assistance where they can find it. And so it's important that we are there to be part of that solution for them.
Okay, we're going to dig in a little bit more on the Artemis Accords in just a second, but I want to go down to Marchel at the end of the table. All right, commercial company, international, how do you guys do it? How do you see this space in terms of going back to the lunar surface together?
Thank you very much, Clay. I think a lot of you saw Jeremy Fix, our chief engineer of ispace-U.S.'s presentation yesterday on the incredible work that we're doing all across the world at iSpace. So, as you heard, iSpace is a global lunar exploration company. We have 300 employees spread from the United States, from Luxembourg, and from Japan. And as Jeremy mentioned, of those 300 employees, we have over 30 nationalities. So even when you visit the office in Tokyo that are working on our Series 1 resilience lander and our Series 3 lander, over half of, or close to half of the population of that office are non-US citizens, non-Japanese citizens. They're from all over the world. You can name a country, Argentina, Turkey. I bet that we have an engineer from one of those countries. And so I see that as the tremendous strength of iSpace, and it really embodies, as Clay mentioned, this new era that we are stepping into. When we recruit from all over the world, we really recruit the best and the brightest. The flip side of that, I think, is you kind of see, that is really kind of a brain drain main manifest. What is iSpace's gain, in a lot of ways, is kind of, the loss of the engineering base of a particular country. So we see this as a very interesting opportunity as more countries seek to create space exploration programs, and specifically lunar exploration programs. This can act as a seed for an industrial base, an engineering workforce. I think of technology and these programs as from a series of relationships. It's the PhD advisor passing the knowledge to their PhD advisor in this unbroken chain. And here in the US, we've been very fortunate to have this unbroken chain stretching back from Apollo. And I think it's very interesting to see these other countries start that chain now, and that's something at iSpace that we're very passionate about building. One other note, you mentioned the rabbit on the moon, and I'd be remiss if not mentioning that, our first 2 missions for our first lander, the second one, which is due to land June 5th, in just a few weeks. That program is called Hakuto-R, and Hakuto means white rabbit. So, that cultural significance of the moon is still very much a part of Japanese culture and of iSpace as well.
I didn't coordinate with that.
No worries.
Just so you guys know, that was
Thank you.
pure coincidence, by the way. That I just always think about whenever I look at the moon, I always think about the rabbit.
Right,
on the moon.
right.
By the way, one of my mentees, Jenna Tawana, works for iSpace.
Oh,
She's
Jenna's
fantastic.
amazing.
Yeah,
So,
thank
you.
Fantastic. All right, let's come back down this way. Niki, I'll go to you. Technology readiness levels. We've had a lot of, and I think we've seen it here over the last couple of days, a lot of technologies that have been kind of being developed in the development phase. Now we're starting to come to fruition. We're seeing a lot of really cool stuff, hardware, demos, things that are getting ready. How does NASA think about that from the infrastructure perspective? How do we get that stuff to the lunar surface? What do you think? How do we do that?
So that is an excellent question. And if anyone was here yesterday afternoon, I kind of pulled on those points by saying that this meeting in particular has been a really special one to me. I also had some consternation because I had like kind of my version of the little angel devil on my shoulder talking about what we've done in the last 5 years as a community. Not only have we developed new novel technologies and capabilities that we have to have, but we've also flown a lot of those on the moon, right? So there's a lot of feeling of celebration and excitement, and we deserve that. We should embrace that. However, that is such a small start to where we need to go next. So the part that I would say really keeps me up at night is more the next 5 or 6 years. I try to think of it, not to be too nerdy, but in a PBB budget cycle time frame. So what I will say on the NASA side is, we're all about inspiration. We're all about, what our children are going to do in the future. We discuss long-term vision and roadmaps and human exploration, all these very exciting things. I mean, that's what drew me as a child, right? But pulling on Blair and everyone's points, really, where we're at this moment in time, to me, is a crossroads. And as much as I love the long-term vision, what I think we're all here, I've been listening throughout the whole meeting and from this community, and the words I hear over and over again are, Blair used steady, stable, foundation, infrastructure, partnerships. I think we have some work to do there. And I think we have to normalize and make those very efficient and effective, both for commercial and international partners. So if I had to say, I used the expression the other day, footprints to foundations. Wes Furman came up with that, and I love it. Going from Apollo to where we are now. We not only have a technology kind of valley of death, which is what I love working in. I think it's terrible branding.
Death Valley? You want to work in Death Valley?
Yeah, but it's actually a real opportunity, right? Where you take those technologies from that kind of mid-TRL level and infuse them or give them the next opportunity on how we're going to use them, how you scale them up and use them. So we also have an equal gap, I think, in where we all go together and how we do that. Things that may sound mundane to the layman, like acquisition strategies, I find very exciting because it's not actually the technologies, like I said, that keep me up at night. They're there. The interest is there. The stakeholders are on board. It is having a way to partner and team and move out, make it happen. Have opportunities for our higher fidelity ground testing and flight opportunities to provide the infrastructure that we need. So I think it's really important. I guess the final message I would say is where we are today, we talk a lot about where we are today, and then we talk a lot about human exploration and architectures down the road. What we do between now and then, and the time is short, the time is very short. What we do between now and then, in my opinion, is make or break. We're at a real crossroads. So I'm hoping this community, we keep coming together, but this is not meant to just be a kumbaya and, ooh, this feels good, and it was cathartic, and we got it out. Now it's about doing the work it takes to go implement this.
Great, thank you. Dennis, in the setup and in the title of this, we talk about a whole of nations approach. What do you mean by, when we say whole of nations approach, what does that mean to you? And from the national security perspective, what does that mean as we look to go to the lunar surface?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. So I think a whole-of-nation approach really means this kind of symbiotic relationship between civil, right, for science, national security for the security aspects, and then commercial, right, for the economic vitality. And all three of those have to be in synchrony to, I think, really make sure that it's not just a moonshot to put another footprint on the moon and then come back. It's there to stay. And so you really have to think about each one of those roles plays a very important part. I think from a national security perspective, I look at some of the things that here at APL we're doing research and technology development for national security, secure comms, cybersecurity, resilient autonomous systems that can operate in austere environments if it's a GPS denied. These are things and aspects of technologies that our DoD and intelligence community, they thrive on. These things need to be exported and transported to this cislunar infrastructure that we're building, right? We want to make sure that our astronauts and our commercial sector folks and anyone that's going up there are safe. And so you also think about the military and how we do anomaly and resolution and emergency preparedness. There are things for those in the military you might think of PACE, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. These are protocols and standards that we adopt in the military to make sure that we're safe and we're effective, and we need to have those same types of things, I think, for cislunar exploration. So the last thing I'll say is I think through, like, together, how do we get there? Think about other eras of exploration, right? There's anything from the Old West to maritime exploration and Arctic exploration. From a national security perspective, the DoD or the government played an important role in making sure that as we expanded west, we had people like the Army Corps of Engineers that built roads. We build railroad, right? So we're gonna have roads in these orbits that we have to get to, orbits in space, making sure that we're secure there. We have to make sure that we've got ports, so launch ports, just like we did naval ports back in the day, and just having the government make sure it's secure so that the economic vitality goals are there and achievable. I think it's important to really make sure that national security is a part of that. And then, you know, the last thing from perspective of strategic high ground, you know, the DoD and the IC, we really do think about what is the next strategic high ground. And ultimately, cislunar is that next frontier of strategic high ground. When you think about a strategic area or domain, you also have to think of things called choke points. So here on Earth, we have choke points, places where if you control that area, you actually have a lot of influence on everyone that has to go through those, like the Strait of Hormuz or Malacca, those types of things. Well, there are actually choke points in space, in cislunar space. We've got 5 Lagrange points, and you can actually think of ways that you can monitor things and actually maybe influence how people are operating in that domain. Earth, Moon, L1, so that Lagrange point between Earth and Moon, L1, that's a great place to sit and actually see what's going on as people are coming out to the moon and back there. The other one, L2, which is on the opposite side of the moon, is for relays, but that's a great place to control and operate a lot of our communications and P&T architectures to make sure that on the far side of the moon you've got that. And so we have to be thinking about that, and the military is great at thinking about how do we make sure that we're not creating inherent vulnerabilities in how we operate. So I think those are the things, and that's why you need a kind of that whole of a country approach.
Thanks for that overview. You know, and I want to dig in a little bit on the Artemis Accords here. I'll do my best to channel Mike Gold. Well, maybe not. I mean, I'd have to talk about the Red Sox, which I'm a Yankees fan, so not going to happen. But look, Norway on May the 15th became the 55th nation to sign the Artemis Accords. Why it took Norway so long, I don't know. They're usually pretty at the forefront of these things. They're very technologically advanced. But we've seen a lot of nations joining in this. And if you don't know about the Accords, and you probably all do, but they really cover transparency, interoperability or standards, emergency assistance, some of the things that you were talking about with PACE, registration of objects, the release of science data, preservation of our heritage, and they allow for resource extraction. They seek to deconflict space activities like operations interference and mitigate against orbital debris. So this is important as a framework, but there's some countries that are notably absent from this, like Russia and China, two of the biggest spacefaring nations. So how do we think about that? What's the, and maybe we can start with you, Michael, on this one. How do we think about that if we really need to cooperate on some of these areas? How do we work with some of these guys on operability or standards or interference protection of the heritage on the moon? How do we do that if they're not partner?
No, it's a great question, Clay, and thank you. Yeah, Norway, Bangladesh got there first, 54 and Norway 55. So that's fantastic. The Artemis Accords really are intended to take, a treaty from the 1960s, right, which is great, but relatively broad. It talks about we need to give each other due regard in our space activities. We need to consult to avoid harmful interference, those types of basic principles, but to take it down like one notch, not all the way down to the LSIC level, right, but like to the level of, okay, from a point of basic principles about how we behave in space, and in particular in the context of lunar missions, the Artemis Accords are intended to help bring that conversation one step closer to a level of granularity in terms of what does it mean to be safe, sustainable, transparent, that kind of thing. The total landscape transformation that you have laid out, Clay, we started with 8 countries in 2020, now 55. That's almost a 600% increase, right, in the number of countries that have committed that, number one, understand this is important. At a political level, the whole government has to agree to join the Accords. It's not just like a space agency or a foreign ministry. It is a government-wide commitment. So that's important. But the real challenge for the Accords, I think, is transitioning to a phase where we talk about implementation, right? Where it's not just a signing ceremony with the ambassador at NASA headquarters. That's fantastic. That has a really big impact. But how do we actually start to apply the Accords in practice? And so we actually have a team in Abu Dhabi this week for a workshop of 35 of those countries are sending experts to argue about those exact issues, to have discussions about what does it mean in practice. And it's a combination of, it's not probably at this level of detail at LSIC, right? But it is a combination of talking about the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what the challenges will be that the trends that we are seeing right now in civil space and in commercial space will present. And then talking about some specific issues. And all of the, last year at the IAC, all of the heads of space agencies from Artemis Accords countries met and focused on a couple things. So they're starting, number one, what does deconfliction mean, right? And you can go a lot of different directions with deconfliction, but it starts by just telling people what you're doing, being transparent. And so we have started to set a precedent with Japan, India, the United States, Luxembourg, all just telling the UN system when we do a mission, where we're going, what we're doing, where we're going to land, what's happening. And the idea is that just becomes like normal, that's just what everybody does. So whenever China, other countries begin to engage in particular missions, that is a practice that is happening at the international level. We're also talking about sharing scientific data. How can the Artemis Accords community foster that more effectively? And interoperability is a big focus right now. Not trying to replicate the international deep space interoperability standards or what Moon to Mars is doing, some of those great initiatives, but helping make sure, do all of those 55 countries know about those standards? Are there gaps? All the different rooms that are talking about standards in different parts of the world, the different working groups that exist, is anyone looking across the spectrum of those communities and identifying where we need to be mobilizing more support, more enthusiasm? And so that's one thing the Accords community is looking at. And the last thing, Clay, I'll stop talking, how do we take those ideas to a broader community, right? And so, for example, last year at the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space created what's called an Action Team for Lunar Activities Consultation, ATLAC, which now includes any member state from the UN COPIOS community that wants to participate, which is a room essentially where you can just talk about these things. And so part of our intention and our work with NASA is to take ideas that start here in our community with our close partners, export them into an Accords community, gain a significant amount of buy-in, and then bring them to a broader community. And by that point, you have a lot more support in the room. And it's not just one country, it's actually 55.
So Blair, Marchel, I'm going to ask you guys. So the last few years before I joined AIAA, I was working in the commercial space station arena. And one of the problems I saw there was that the space station today is this great framework, international, all government-to-government barters, stuff like that. But when you talk about a commercial space station, how do you deal with a foreign space agency or foreign government? The Artemis Accords, do they help investors, commercial companies to do business on? Is there enough there? Do we need something more for commercial operations on the moon? Or do you sit under that umbrella? How do you think about the Artemis Accords from a commercial or investor perspective?
There's so much I want to say. I want to talk first, I think, about the economic value of the moon. I firmly believe that the moon is the most valuable real estate in our solar system. And I think its economic and strategic potential exceeds the value of every stock exchange on Earth, which makes it a very critical domain. And I think the Artemis Accords is an incredible first step. But when we talk about implementation, I think it really is going to land on whoever is able to establish infrastructure and a long-term meaningful presence first. And critical terrain, once it's built and surveyed, won't be available forever. And those that are first will have the opportunity and the burden, responsibility to establish norms and rules that will last for decades, potentially a century. So to echo Niki, I think decisions made in the next 3 to 6 years are going to define the next century. And I'm newer to the moon. My focus has been on LEO, and I firmly believe that LEO is where we need a robust infrastructure for any kind of meaningful deep space exploration. And of course, the commercial opportunities are immense. But the moon is not being framed in the right context as far as urgency. I really see this as our nation's biggest obstacle right now. And so, I think in terms of implementation, it's really about engaging the private sector, getting the private sector to a place where it can scale and be empowered to make decisions. And I think that mainly comes from a demand signal. We've been talking about commercial space stations and ISS replacement for over a decade, and yet CLD does not have a demand signal today. In the past 25 years, we've had 4 different decommissioning dates for station: 2015, 2020, 2024, and as of late 2030. But oh wait, that date may slip, or it may even come sooner. There's still even uncertainty around that date. And I think where we are with the moon is in a really similar place. We have dozens of incredible companies working on brilliant lunar relevant technology, and yet there's still no clear path to sustainment, which I think is what Niki has been, grappling with. And I can really empathize with being in the private sector and being in a position where long-term investment in infrastructure right now is very difficult and even risky because of this weak demand signal. There is no coordinated multi-agency roadmap that overlaps with commercial capability. And I really think that if we want to incentivize a lunar industrial base, we need demand signals that are constant and steady and multi-year. For example, we will buy X kilowatts of lunar power in 2027 and 2028. And that is going to be the mechanism that will unlock the giant private capital markets that are just drooling to get into space. I talk to family offices, PE and VC groups every week, and they are so excited about space. It is palpable. There is so much energy. But they're also doing their homework, and they want to make sure that these companies can withstand volatility, and they're hard to kill, and they can weather the storm. And so a single customer model, especially one tied to civil space, is just not going to work anymore. I think, I'm really off topic now, but we'll just go with it. My advice to lunar companies today is you have to have more than one product, you have to have more than one customer, and you have to have multiple classes of customer. This term dual use gets thrown around a lot, but it's really just kind of the standard now. And, we've really gotten far from what you asked.
It's okay. It's okay. Marchel, is there enough there with this government-to-government accords for iSpace to do business on the lunar surface?
And I resonate. Everything you say resonates with me a lot. And I think there are, the Artemis Accords, I think, is I think for us and for this community is tremendously important. I do agree completely with you that we envision a world in which we don't have the single customer model where we have many nation states, many different companies in each of these nation states are able to participate and seek transportation to the moon and be part of this thriving lunar economy. When you talk about demand signal, one of the important things I think the Artemis Accords did do is it's valuable in that as countries accede or agree to these principles, it shows, despite the Artemis Accords not being this firm bilateral treaty or multilateral treaty system, it shows a commitment, a political commitment by the leadership of these countries that the moon is important and that the moon is the future. It's an acknowledgement of the reality that there is tremendous momentum towards the moon. We saw just a month ago, we had 3 simultaneous lunar landers en route to the moon at the same time, like a fleet of lunar landers. I mean, when else in history has this happened? And I think that momentum is only going to get increasingly, it's going to only build further and further. On the topic of the Artemis Accords, I think under the auspices of that, and I don't want to get ahead too much on the ISRU point, but the concept of space resources and space resource transactions are tremendously important. So of course, as we know, under the terms of the Outer Space Treaty, we cannot appropriate the territory of the moon, but I think the United States and iSpace believes it's important to acknowledge that we can have private property on the moon, and that if we were to extract resources from the moon, that we can own that. And I think from an investor perspective, having that certainty is tremendously important. And I think the Outer Space Treaty supports this, and certainly the Artemis Accords supports this as well. When our second mission, Mission 2, lands on the moon in June, we're going to execute 2 space resources transactions with NASA. We're going to collect some lunar regolith on our lander, and under a framework established by the Japanese government, we're going to have a licensed space resources transaction and transfer in situ ownership of that regolith to NASA for money. We are also, at the same time, going to deploy a rover that is licensed through Luxembourg. And that rover has a scoop that we've designed with a terrestrial mining company, and that rover is going to pick up some regolith in the scoop. We're going to claim property of that, and then we're going to sell that through the Luxembourgish space resource transaction framework to NASA as well. And this, if successful, will be the first ever extraterrestrial sale of space resource in history, and we hope will set the precedent that you can own resources. If we find water, if we prospect for water, that we can own it, and investors will know that they're able to put capital towards that. So I think that's tremendously important as well. And I think, a quick note on the interoperability side, I think we see that as a huge, it's great to see the work that Open Lunar is doing and others in establishing, a baseline for interoperability, GEGSLA as well. And I think the other thing that I think is coming up on us very quickly. So right now, when there's just 1 or 2 missions at the moon, interoperability, where are you at, where are we, not a big issue. When we see these heavy landers that we've been talking about, landing dozens and dozens of payloads on the moon that are interfering and throwing up regolith and impinging on each other, I think rapidly we're going to see a need to coordinate much better.
So by the way, Luxembourg, you're talking about Luxembourg in space, right? Like Luxembourg, if you know anything from the geocomsat world, which is where I started in space, they were at the forefront of geostationary commercial satellites with SES. There's a huge satellite operation facility in Luxembourg. You can drive across Luxembourg in like an hour, but it's like in the middle of Luxembourg in this giant field, one of the biggest satellite operators in the world. So they are at the forefront of space a lot of the time. So
very much so. Interesting
note. Niki, these guys talked about demand signal. They talked about NASA as one of many customers up on the lunar surface. You think about more technology maturation, but if you talk about things like, and Dennis mentioned, interoperability, right? So we need power on the lunar surface. We need to send a demand signal on that. How do we get that? How do we get that there faster so that we can start to do these activities?
So first of all, I want to make sure everyone here knows about the Logic Consortium. We've got Daniel over there. So he leads that. So that is a consortium for interoperability that spun off. DARPA supports that task, but it is a joint LSIC, DARPA, APL effort because interoperability comes up everywhere, as it should. Many times folks think of that as more on the architecture or the end game side, but you really have to consider that in your early design process. So for technologists, that's an important early discussion. I did want to revisit, to answer your broader question, I mentioned earlier about having, some consternation and thinking about the messaging here and, having a little bit of a bipolar where we've been, where we're going kind of thing. And the reason, I think that root of that consternation, I was thinking about it yesterday, is because I feel a real sense of accountability to this community from the government role perspective. Everything everyone said here is so incredibly valid, and the bottom line is that, again, we are at that crossroads, and time is of the essence. So, I mentioned earlier, revisiting that theme of stability and foundation and certainty. I really believe that on the government side, as a whole of government, that we are here to provide you with, yes, a common long-term vision, but what goes with that, what has to be coupled with that, is the tactical aspects, right? The tactical aspects of what are the next steps, how do we make progress toward that every budget cycle, which is how I just think now, but every 5 to 6 years, how are we making tangible progress to getting there, right? So how do we do that? Really kind of summing up what y'all have been saying, I look at the government role as we kind of have bookends to what you're all doing in the middle, whether it be international or industry. The tech development and maturation, I could not stress enough. I'm not saying this just because I work in technology. I work in technology because of what I'm about to say, and that is that it is a story that gets lost a lot. We jump to that kind of end game and think about where we're going to pick up once that miracle occurs here. Technology maturation is the miracle occurs here, and it takes work, and it takes planning, and we're there right now. And you can ask many, many companies here about that, and they will tell you that's where we're at now. So the bookends to me are, the government we need to be supporting, providing that long-term vision, and having a tactical plan for how we're supporting this tech maturation and infusion to get the TRL up. So we can take those novel technologies that are so cool, that everybody thinks are cool, but turn them into scaled institutional capabilities. If they're novel technologies forever, that means they're not incorporated into your missions. That is not good. So we need to take that next step. And then the other side of the bookend of that is once you do get to that other side, you have to be sending that demand signal from the start. Why are those companies going to show up? Why do those international countries want to join the accords? Because they believe us. They believe what we've been saying for the last 5 years. They believe the geopolitical. They believe the economic value. They believe in exploration and that this nation should be on the moon. We have to provide that stability, which translates to a demand signal. So I was so happy to hear what you were saying in terms of real, tangible, this can't be lip service, right? This can't just be a nice, fun thing we all talk about and then we go back. We need to create the mechanisms and the ways to do this together. So like buying some regolith, we've talked about this with our additive construction companies, building small landing pads. You can do those things as part of the technology demonstrations. And I'm putting together a kind of pamphlet to show right now because I think it's very telling. It's 2 pages. It's not 9,000 charts. It doesn't need a lot of words. It's 2 pages. 1 page is what this community has done in the last 5 years, like we talked earlier, and taken to the moon already. The other side is all pictures, no graphics, real photos of real hardware. The other side is many more pictures of all the hardware we have right now, all the technologies we've been developing and co-investing in with all of you for the last 5 years that are looking for that next step. Where do we go now? And that's what comes up every single meeting. So I think that is all of our charge, is to sit down and put together the exact type of mechanisms, the type of investments, and we are stakeholders together. Going back to what you said in the very, very beginning, when we go together, Bridenstine said early on, that was not just a beautiful saying. It meant money. It meant time. It meant energy. It means that we are partners in this.
Thank you. Des, I'm going to go back to the national security piece of this for a second, if I may. At the end of World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement. Basically, the United States came and said, we've got the largest standing blue water navy in the world. We're going to protect all the shipping lanes. We're going to protect the the ability for nations to trade and transport people across oceans. A lot of parallels, by the way, between law of the sea and space law, right? There's a lot of parallels that go on between these two. So when we think about the lunar surface, who's in charge of it? Who's going to protect us up there? Who's going to allow these companies to do free business up there, extract resources? How do we think about that? And I'm going to take a piece of, we have DARPA, we got Space Force. Are they thinking about this? Are they thinking about how we would protect doing business, not just the civil piece of this, but the commercial piece of this?
So I'm not going to speak for the Department of Defense and what they're actually thinking about, having space cops on the moon or anything like that.
Space cops.
But I do
space cops.
I do think that there's, when we talk about these initial outposts, again, I'll go back to the analogy of the Old West and expansion. I mean, a lot of times the people and the folks that were in these clustered, little outposts made up their own norms and laws and behaviors to make sure that they could all survive. And I think we're going to see that on the moon as well. I think as these commercial companies get up there and they're pushing the boundaries, and it's not just about some military fighter pilot that gets on the moon and is standing around and swinging golf clubs and things like that, and they're actually trying to do commercial, transactions and make money and sustain. I think it's going to be incumbent upon these companies, in conjunction with the government, to make sure that, one, are we all safe? Can we survive? What things do we need to adopt here that we didn't think about terrestrially that we just need to make sure are established so that we can all coordinate and survive together? I think you want the military to still be thinking about things like space domain awareness. I mean, you mentioned orbital debris and things like that. We thankfully don't have an orbital debris problem in cislunar space yet. It's a large volume. But I think you want someone like the Department of Defense, in conjunction with NASA, the State Department, and Department of Commerce, and these other entities, you want them still investing our government capital into those types of systems and architectures so that commercial companies are able to focus on what we need them to do, make money, economic vitality, and keep us at the forefront of this, right? I think from just an American with the Artemis Accords, we want to make sure we're there. We are establishing these norms of behavior before someone else gets there and does that, right? Kind of think of like the internet, right? We created the internet and we established the protocols, and decades and decades later, we're still using a lot of those same things. I think Blair said it. It's like if we aren't the ones that are doing that, I think you stand the chance to lose out on that leadership opportunity for decades, right? And so I think the Department of Defense and with others is going to be, I think a very key part of people being protected as they go, and maybe offering, safety of life. If something happens, you want the government to be able to come in and say, hey, we're going to help you, and making sure that everyone has those protocols and interfaces so that we can communicate, I need help, right, we're coming, right? All those things, I think you want the government to have that part. But yeah, I'm not sure we're about the space cops yet. I think that's still to come.
That's a TBD.
Stormtroopers.
That's a show on Netflix, I think, coming. I got a question from the audience. Is there anything, we just talked about a little bit about oceans and other parallels to Lunar. Is there anything unique about working on the moon together? Is there anything unique from a commercial or government perspective or investor perspective about that we're not thinking about here? I think it was an interesting question, right? I mean, again, draw parallels to the oceans, but maybe there's something, we're far away. We're what, over 238,000 miles from home, right, when we're up there, on an average. By the way, I'm not do the math, but I know the orbit moves. But is there anything unique about it, going far away? Yeah, Niki, you want to talk about it?
I'll start just by saying, before I was doing this, I was doing in-space manufacturing, so 3D printing and ISRU and all those things. And I tell you, the real wake-up call is we say it a lot, but when you start to live it and process what the implications are, it's huge, is the paradigm shift, even going from space station to the moon and then from moon to Mars, of being Earth independent. Everything changes. So even things like on space station where, if we have an eclipse, something to go wrong, we have orbital replacement units, right? We take the whole thing home, we have more on the ground, we launch it up, and then when they get it home, they take it apart and figure out what actually went wrong, and it's a valve or a seal or whatever. When you're on the moon, if something goes wrong, I mean, it could be as simple as, a seal or electronics board. It doesn't have to be the main, big technology development we've done. There are a lot of gotchas, and it's a tough environment. But when you think about the people there or from the ground, we're gonna have to be able to not only fix it, but we'll have to be able to figure out what it was, identify what went wrong, which you have to do during the design process, right? And you have to design it for that maintainability. So I think that, from a technical perspective, that is one of the things that keeps me up at night a lot, because it's something that it's everywhere and it's nowhere. Just kind of like our autonomous systems as well. It's so inherent in all we do. But in terms of having a collective plan and approach for the design principles to that, I think that's going to be way different.
Marchel, how do you guys think about that with doing a rover or whatever it is you're doing up there? I mean, it's got to be able to survive the lunar night. It's got all kinds of issues here.
Yeah, it's quite. It's quite a hostile environment, as I think the last few days have really underscored. Of course, I think, and I'm not an engineer, so I won't go too much into the design of it. Our Apex 1.0 vehicle is ultimately designed to include. To be evolved to include lunar night survivability, to have that persistence and to survive those dramatic shifts in temperature over the 14-day lunar night. But I think the biggest thing right now is there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, I think the moon has, it's very harsh. You are able to interfere and interact in very detrimental ways with other actors on the moon through such things like plume impingement, and we don't quite know exactly, how far does this plume go? I remember having a conversation many years ago at IAC with a member of the U.S. government trying to talk about this, the safety zones, and when we land our first mission, what should our safety zone be, and how do we determine this? And his response was, well, this is of course something for you to decide, but we just ask you to justify it well. And there's really, right now, there's a lot of great science out there, but there's a lot that could be done, and we're constantly learning new things with each landing. Of course, with Firefly, there's amazing videos of the plume and just seeing how far it travels. And when you think about these larger scale landers, that how much does it loft into the exosphere, and does that interfere with low-flying lunar orbiters, and how do we mitigate these things? I think that's very interesting. So I think my answer is it's uncertain. We talk about a lot of these norms of behavior. We're trying to be proactive, and how do we, responsibly declare our behavior as much as possible. But I think we need to be flexible to understand that as we learn more over the coming decade, we're going to have to integrate these best practices and, along the way.
Blair, looking at investing in these types of things, what's a viable technology put on the lunar surface? You guys think about that from a risk standpoint? How do you measure that in terms of doing business on the moon?
Yeah, I think, Clay, that most people are asleep. I think that is what is most unique to me, is that we live in a world where private equity is gobbling up what seems like every industry, and we have this new subscription-based economy, and people are looking for value in every place, yet the moon has a landmass of North and South America combined. It's riddled with critical resources. Asteroids have been hitting the moon for millennia. And we still don't even really understand where these critical terrain, high-value areas are going to be. And so, I think from an investment standpoint, the beauty of this is that it's really exciting. And, capitalism historically has proven to be a boon for this country. And so I think that, what we're going to see here over the next 3 to 4 years needs to be a whole of market strategy that really encapsulates private markets. The government should not and cannot carry the entire load on its own. And, we do have this excitement. There is this energy out there as it relates to space. We just need a more coordinated approach and a little bit more of a steady, constant demand signal from the government so that this long-term investment can be unlocked, because I truly think the moon is the most valuable real estate in our solar system.
I'm going to turn to Michael and Dennis. So a lot of questions from the audience about what we're doing to attract other nations, right, into these accords, and both from national security and civil space or diplomatic perspective. How do we do that? How do we find, by the way, how do we go from 8 to 55? What was the strategy around that, and are we doing it on the national security side as well? Are we having that dialogue?
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks, Clay. I think, so it's been a combination. We've had countries that sign and just mail it to them, right? Like, they don't have to ask.
No ceremony.
No ceremony. They're just like, congratulations, you have a new member. And that's one of the beauties of the Accords, is that it is open to any country that wants to sign. It is not an agreement with the United States. We signed it on our own volition in 2020. And countries can commit sua sponte anytime if they choose to do so. But I think often it works better when it's seen as a parallel to cooperation or integration, either cooperation in the civil sense or integration into our commercial sector. You know, I think a lot of countries are interested in the Accords, partially because they want to have a seat at the table of defining the modern space age and where it will go, so that they are preserving for their future development, right, their ability to influence the right and left lanes, the rules of the road. But also partially because they're excited about the prospect of working with the United States and other leading space powers, right? And so I think so the growth has been really important, has been valuable. I hope that trend continues, but I hope it continues in a way that gets us deeper into the substance, right? And that gets us deeper into the implementation and brings along emerging space nations with us. And I will say, I mean, to the earlier conversation, there are a lot of countries that are now setting up their own domestic space, civil space systems, their own national security programs, and certainly they definitely want their own space industries, right? And they will, they are looking for ways to kind of build an infrastructure, a legal framework, a regulatory framework to foster that type of an ecosystem, and they're gonna borrow it from somewhere, right? And so I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we are the most available and helpful partner, because it just improves, to Blair's earlier point and Marchel's earlier point, industry may at some point is already relying on international partners and opportunities to kind of balance out the funding uncertainties that might exist here in Washington, right? And so the more that we can reduce uncertainty for our commercial sector by kind of leveling the playing field, making sure that a growing number of countries operate and think similarly to us in space, that's helpful, but also kind of widening the range of market opportunities that exist for our commercial sector.
Dennis, I had an opportunity to meet with Jay Raymond before he became the head of the Space Force, right? And so this is back when he was running the JSPOC out in Vandenberg Air Force Base. And even before he started in standing up the Space Force, he was bringing in international partners to sit on console, do joint space operations. He was bringing in international partners to do wargaming exercises, to integrate the capabilities. Do we think about that? You know, don't want to get too far down into it. Do we think about that for the moon and cislunar activities? Is that part of the scope that Space Force and the national security community thinks about?
I think it starts, you know, with us cooperating in LEO and then extending out to GEO, and we've got partnerships, you know, Five Eyes, UK, Australia, and those types of partners where it's about operating together in the domain and then making sure that we can contribute to our collective safety and security in that domain, right? And so you think about the interoperable standards of communication. We are in the same ops floors because one of the things we haven't talked about a lot is, you know, from a like air traffic or space traffic command and control, how do you make sure that someone is looking out and making sure that they're deconflicting orbits, or, you know, you're launching from the moon while things are going on in orbit. And so the Department of Defense and the Space Force has been at the forefront of how do we make sure that we can do command and control for space, right? It starts with space domain awareness, but it's also about communicating with your partners and friends to make sure, did you see something? Yeah, I saw that too. Was it a coronal mass ejection? No, I don't think so. Okay, well now we have to do another triage to see what actually happened to my asset. And I think you're gonna see that, I would hope you would see that extend into cislunar space to make sure that we're all communicating and being safe together with that.
I was telling the panel in the ready room, we were getting ready yesterday, I did an event on the Hill that was aviation focused, and we were talking about national airspace and advanced air mobility, and how do we do commercial with drones, with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, with short takeoff and landing aircraft. How do we coordinate all this, knowing that we don't really have great technology, Niki, below 3,000 feet? It's mostly visual flight rules. We don't have good radar. We don't have. So when I think about this from a lunar perspective, we talk a lot about deconfliction or non-interference and things like that. Niki, how do we think about that from a technology standpoint to create a system where we're not running into each other, where rovers aren't crashing into each other, where we've got the right things in place technology-wise to be able to do that traffic
Well,
management?
I love this question. And by the way, this answer applies to so many other things. This is just one great example that there's an obvious gap right now. So going back to some of the earlier points, you know, it's not only our architecture. If I think about 5 years ago, the big word we all heard over and over again starting out was sustainable, right? If you've noticed, we've migrated more to kind of infrastructure, which I think is the first step on the way to sustainability. That infrastructure requires a lot of technologies. So our implementation plan, it's not only the technologies that have to be sustainable, our implementation and execution plan, has to be sustainable as well. So one way we're doing that is, I mentioned at the kickoff on the first day, who here is familiar with Lift 1? I'm hoping everybody remembers Lift 1. Yeah. So we've got, this side of the room really did. We got to talk to that side of the room. I just realized over here, wait a minute, we got to break. So LIFT, is very important to remember what LIFT stood for, right? It's the Lunar Infrastructure Foundational Technologies, right? It is all these things we're talking about. We took the one off of that I talked about on Monday, because what we're really backing up and doing now in all these conversations is exactly what you're bringing up here. There are some technical priorities. There are some gaps that are larger than others. There's some very real-world kind of things that result in some of these need to be addressed serially. Some can be addressed in parallel. There needs to be a holistic plan. So I mentioned that I'm hoping to be able to put out an RFI or an RFP soon, but we've been working with APL and NASA to put together kind of a framework for that minimum viable mission-driven plan, so that we can create that required infrastructure in the most efficient, effective way. But that plan is larger than just one mission, right, or one demo. It requires kind of that holistic approach for getting those technologies matured, but that means talking about these exact kind of capability-based gaps that you're bringing up. So I hope to be able to release that soon to the community so that we can get to work together on executing that.
I have a question from the audience about academia in this whole thing. We talked about national security, we talked about civil, talked about commercial. What about academia? What about universities? What about research? What about partnerships around that? Anyone want to take that one on?
I will.
All right, go ahead.
And I'll try to maybe get prompts going.
Yeah.
So we don't talk about this enough. I think our academia is obviously from a workforce and skill set development for the good of our nation. I'm sure everyone here knows, you know, through the 80s and 90s kind of what happened with our propulsion skill sets, and that's a real big lesson learned that we've been working to rectify for a few decades. So developing those skill sets, number one, is really key, and that's one of STMD, one of our Space Tech Clear charters is to do that. With that said, though, I think academia is kind of unsung heroes a little bit, because the basic R&D, the really innovative, creative, consistent pipeline of R&D happening is what leads to all of this. Again, you have to back out from where we are today, though, and get that started and nurture it and foster it and grow it into that fun valley of death that I get to do, and so that it all can eventually get infused and scaled. And we're way behind the curveball on that. So one of the hardest messages we try to get across is if you cut that R&D going on with academia, which, by the way, is a very cost-efficient and effective way to get those skill sets developed, you're going to see the repercussions down the road. You may not see them right away, but we will have significant repercussions to affect all of this.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
So just as, you know, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, this is where the labs and their, you know, other labs like us, this is where we live. Is we love to be in one foot in academia, where we're looking at that foundational research for whatever it is, and then at a lab, what we are able to do is take that idea, that concept, mature it to the point where you can build rapid prototypes and demonstrations, and then we look out to industry and to the government to say, we think we found a way to pathfind something scalable and sustainable if you do this, right? And so we'll demonstrate it the first time and then work with industry and the government to actually scale it to a point where it has commercial viability. And so I think you cannot do, you know, cislunar sustainability without having as a part of the equation academia, the labs, industry, and government all working together to rapidly iterate on these technologies and keep them going.
Thanks. And just to add, I mean, from a foreign policy perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, I would argue our academic sector in the United States is a huge force multiplier for our ability to cooperate with foreign partners and international partners. You know, it is at the, I don't want to speak for our NASA colleagues in the room, but it is, I think it's safe to say, it's not NASA's job to build foreign space agencies, to build their capabilities, right? Like NASA has a task, a really difficult task, and it is focused on US capabilities, right? And so a lot of partners that come to the United States and expect to find a lot of help in the US government, there's just not the funding streams, there's not the programs. It's really difficult for us to be able to deliver that type of assistance. So what's another alternative? And if you look at the UAE, for example, United Arab Emirates, their partnership and collaboration with UC Boulder was foundational to where their space program is today, right? And so that's a really interesting model to think about, and there's a ton of other partners that we all the time kind of refer our international partners to kind of have conversations that are more difficult for us to have. I'd also say we are turning to academia. We can't say exactly who right now, but like we're in the process of lining up partnerships with 3 universities in the United States to help us think about the next 20 years of geopolitical competition in the context of lunar surface activity, and to help us think about the intersection of law, technology, and international cooperation. So
That's a great example with LASP and what they've been doing and by the way, the reverse is true as well, right? When you talk to foreign space agencies, it says our job is not to fund or buy services from US companies.
yeah.
It's an interesting problem, by the way, because barters have been used for 24 years or even longer than that if you think about the space station, almost 30 years. So how do you shift into buying space as a service, more like CRS COTS and commercial crew programs? A lot of questions here about identifying what kind of novel tech to focus on and what the government role or maybe even universities' role play. Anybody want to try that one? What's the coolest novel tech out there? What do we need? Maybe Niki, you could start, or I don't know, Marchel, you could talk about what's the coolest stuff and how does the US government help support that?
That's very interesting. I mean, I think a lot of the novel tech, you know, I think on the lunar, when you are building a spacecraft tactically to land on the moon, you're in this really interesting spot because on the one hand, you want to use the least novel technology as possible to really increase your chance of successful landing. Which if you can't do that, so for example, our Series 1, our Apex 1.0, the landing legs are fixed. They don't even deploy because even the deployment is, it's a risk we don't have to take. We don't want to do it. We want the solar panels to be fixed. We don't want them to move. And so that really means that it's hard for, I think, in a lot of ways, industry and space programs, private space programs, are disincentivized from taking these huge technological leaps unless there is the reason to do so and backing from a sponsor, from a government approach. I think you see this a lot in the lunar night survival world. I mean, to the amount of IRAD necessary to really prepare this without, some poker pull from NASA or a commercial customer makes it hard to justify because you're intrinsically complicating your architecture, and you are even trivially or on the margins you're complicating it. So when you go into these systems engineering reviews, of course you're going to elect for the most simplest solution. So I think that's an example of where NASA can try to incentivize some of these decisions through some monetary funding or some sort of requirements.
Niki, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think that just really reiterates all the things that I've been talking about. So I'll mention this exact reason we went from Lift 1 to this Lift framework that I mentioned. It takes all of this into consideration. Some APL brought in some of their kind of lead mission design folks to laid out all the capabilities we talk about. So for example, we want to do ISRU. Well, anything that you want to do on the surface, you have to have power to do it, right? So power is a basic, I'll say, utility. And then you've got, surviving the actual environment, dealing with the dust, dealing with, surviving the night, mobility, all of these things. So when you look at the sequencing and, what would be that most effective, efficient way of hitting those heavy hitters that help then propagate the actual kind of commercial application use cases, that's what this framework does. And so that's what we're wanting to put out as an RFI to start with, to get the community feedback on that exact framework. And through that sequencing of events, that's a true roadmap because you can align that with schedules and budgets and stakeholders. And it's not a roadmap. I'll say, remember this, it is not a roadmap until you can do that, it's an idea until you can align it with your budget and your schedule.
Niki, there was a follow-up question on that, which is are we aligned with other government agencies? Is it just NASA alone here? Are we aligned with other stakeholders, DOE, Defense, other organizations that are looking at some of these technologies?
I believe that we are extremely aligned. I can't speak to all of it, but I will say that our priorities and our common objectives, what I think is the real sweet spot, in my opinion, is we may have end applications that are different across the government sectors, how we use the technologies. But in terms of getting those core capabilities matured, and again, taken from the novel technology to an institutional capability, we have so many common areas of interest. So we need to co-invest, and that's what we're working toward, is co-investing and getting that TRL up to the point. Then everybody can go use for whatever application they need to, right, either terrestrial or space. So I think there's still a lot more opportunity there, but we are certainly doing more of that. I mentioned DARPA actually sponsors the Interoperability Consortium, and we all work closely together. DOE on the power side, Space Force, obviously. So, but I think there's more opportunity for that common technology investment.
And Clay, I mean, we've gone this whole time, I don't think we've mentioned AI once, so shame on us. So I'll be that guy.
How do we get that? How do we do that?
Make sure you throw that bomb and run.
No, just from a perspective of, you know, I think when we're going to see true sustainability is when we can kind of, I'll say, sever the tie from Earth, but really make sure that you can independently operate safely on the moon. And so some of that is those novel technologies we're talking about are sensors and algorithms that allow machine learning to recognize unsafe situations, and instead of you having to telemetry that back to the Earth to say, oh, don't do that because it might, you know, actually cause some sort of accident or anomaly, you're immediately able to make decisions right there in the moment, real-time decision making. And so I think we have to find ways, and you know, the DoD's, we're trying to do this as well for, you know, not cislunar, but just in general. How do you make sure that your spacecraft can make decisions or autonomously follow, you know, decision trees such that they can be more responsive to emergencies and threats and things like that? So,
two quick add-ons.
Yes.
Because that's such a good point. Yeah. One is, we keep saying the novel technologies. You are spot on with that, but they can't be novel when we fly them. If we're talking about crew, we keep saying novel. It takes energy, effort, time, and money to take them from novel to that point. That's that miracle occurs here thing I'm talking about, where we kind of do that mental jump. And that's the place I live. That's why it's the Valley of Death. We kind of just imagine it happening. So there's a lot of work that we need to put into, because we do need to count on those also for the maintainability aspect.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
about Hal, but good Hal, right? Not
Yes.
the bad Hal from right. Okay. So I know we were slightly delayed at launch, but I want to make sure we have a little hold. But I want to make sure that we stick the landing, and our center of gravity doesn't tip us over. So I want to have everybody join me in thanking the panel, and thank you guys for the great questions.